Is my screen visible? Is my audio clear?
Yes, Murli.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, it's audible.
Yeah, thank you. So I will go ahead and start my PhD thesis colloquium titled "The Effectiveness of Technology Business Incubation."
You should be louder. You should be louder.
Okay, sir. Is it better now? So my thesis supervisor is Professor M.H. Balasubramania. I dedicate this thesis to my dad, who I lost during my PhD journey. So the agenda for today is we'll present you a brief executive summary followed by introduction and background literature with respect to incubation and broadly entrepreneurship support. And we will sort of draw a conceptual framework of the gaps that we identified from the literature, and then propose our research objectives and formulate this issue of measuring effectiveness of incubation as a multi-level problem. And we will present our 3 analytical objectives results, and then finally we synthesize our results and present implications and some policy and managerial implications. So entrepreneurship is critical to driving innovation, creating wealth, jobs in any economy. And entrepreneurship, with respect to startups, promise high growth. And this goes back to 1979 with the classic Birch, study. Although they create a lot of jobs and grow at a high rate, they also fail a lot because of uncertainties. So it's sort of necessary to support entrepreneurship, and this is even more critical in transitioning economies where supporting structures are not fully developed.
Can you be a bit more louder?
Okay, sir. Sir, is it better now? So technology business incubators have actually emerged as a key entrepreneurship support vehicle as of today. And but still we don't see many empirical studies examining the effectiveness of incubators itself. So in this study we examine the effectiveness of incubators, taking into consideration 3 different stakeholders that we call as 3 levels of incubation support. Macro level, we are looking at the government. Meso level, which is an intermediate level, we are looking at the host university that has an incubator. And at the micro level, we are looking at startups that are actually pursuing entrepreneurship. From these, we draw certain inferences with respect to effectiveness of the incubation support itself. And then we'll present certain strategies and implications from the study itself. So in the introduction and background literature, we'll present broadly literature on entrepreneurship support and draw some pertinent research questions. And then we look at resources, processes that are enabled during incubation, talk about stakeholders who are in the incubation itself. And then we sort of look at how do we measure performance of incubation as a whole. So entrepreneurs take a central role in the sense there are very few people who take up entrepreneurship because of the uncertainty, and there is a lot of failure with respect to early stage entrepreneurs. But they do promise high growth, and hence we need to support them. But institutional structures are not fully developed, and technology progress is also filled with uncertainty. So it's necessary that we support entrepreneurs. So this is a brief history of where this whole entrepreneurship support actually started. This is the Batavia industrial estate. That is a dilapidated industrial estate in New York, where first generation Italian Joe Mancuso actually started buying these large facilities and converting them for smaller entrepreneurs and rooms that can be given on rent. But Mancuso was actually offering much more than just the shared real estate and secretarial services. So if you want a credit in the bank, he could arrange it. If you needed more space, he'll hook you up. So Joe Mancuso is sort of credited to be the starting point of modern entrepreneurs incubation support itself. There is another important personality with respect to incubation. His name is Lauren Schultz. The people from ex-Navy of US started this company called Engineering Research Associates, which was building high-performance computing machines, and that was also happening in a sort of an incubation setup. So ERA was simply a building full of rooms, and each room housed a separate project, and each one was actually having a lot of action with respect to innovation itself. And Schultz goes on to create a lot of incubators around the US. And if you may, the supercomputer company Cray Systems, one machine that we have in SERCISC also, was born out of one of these incubation facilities actually. Over the period of last few decades, incubation as a service has evolved. At the first wave that we saw with respect to Mancuso or others, the basic infrastructure, real estate and facilities was the primary need, and that was being focused on. And we actually see a lot of studies with respect to facilities at that period. And it later evolved into providing more business support, mentoring, commercialization, and providing some networking support itself. After 2000, primarily the internet era, where ICT and the use of it for incubation increased, more specialization actually was supported by incubators, and technology transfer, product development, all different forms of services actually evolved. So this is obviously commensurate with the number of incubators that is growing globally. So if you look at it, there was a slight drop in the developed economies after the 2000 recession, but the developing economies actually kicked in, and the overall rate at which the incubators across the world has been growing at a pretty fast pace. Yet we don't have a full understanding of how effective they are with respect to their own performance. That's the reason for this study. We cannot put both emerging economies and developed economies on the same pedestal to compare because of several reasons. We list some of the reasons here. The developed economies actually have pretty well developed infrastructure, and they have high private sector participation with respect to investment or incubator emergence, etc. They have a very strong appropriation regime with respect to intellectual property. There are enabling acts like Bayh-Dole, which made sure that individual universities can take technology commercialization. That led to sort of proliferation of technology transfer offices all over the world. Started with the US, but it spread to US as well. And specialization also is pretty well established in the developed economies. But India's case is not so, in the sense infrastructure needs still stimulus and development actually, and government support is sort of critical. Private sector is not that well participating with respect to entrepreneurship support and the initiatives around it. We only became party to the intellectual property agreement with the WTO back in 1995. So, which means our IP regime is actually sort of in the early stages, and overall services also still evolving. That said, we have actually seen a big growth with respect to number of incubators that are supported by the government. Here we are giving indicative figures. Back in 2009, there were only 55 incubators. When we started this research in 2016, there were about 100 incubators. As of now, the same program that we are going to be studying has about 150 plus incubators supported. And the intent of the government is actually to sort of create a research park, startup center, or incubator at every NIT and IIT, which means there is room for further growth with respect to incubation, and the understanding of incubation itself is critical. This is the spread of incubators across the country. The circle that we have marked is the scope of this study, covering Maharashtra, Gujarat, Andhra, Telangana, and Karnataka, Tamil Nadu. These are the 6 states that we are considering, primarily supported by the the central government schemes. We'll cover the scope a little bit more in detail later on. So the pertinent research questions that we arrived at after looking at the whole phenomena and the growth, we wanted to sort of explore what is the role of incubators in an entrepreneurial ecosystem. How do we evaluate the performance of incubators, and how have incubation along with the stakeholders actually have kept pace with the needs of startups in the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem in the country. So before we begin, we provide a brief set of definitions that we'll be concerned with throughout this thesis work. First is a startup. Startup is a legal entity with no precedence, which means it will not have been born out of any other larger company or another company or a subsidiary, for example. It is set up as a private limited that is no more than 10 years old and should not have a turnover of more than 25 crores. And it is involved in economic activities, which means it's a for-profit private limited company. Whereas incubator is a not-for-profit company, typically registered as a Section 8 company, and this is supported by a government, a policy or institutional mechanism, and it's sort of the role that it plays is around emergence and development of startups, supporting entrepreneurship as a whole. If such an incubator is actually located within a university, we call that a university-based incubator. By universities, we mean it broadly, in the sense it could be a college. We don't mean the university per se, but larger higher education institutes are what we are concerned about when we say university. Specialization of an incubator is, an incubator is considered specialized if it supports no more than one industry classification. So we take the first digit of the NIC code. And tier 1 city is defined by the Department of Agriculture, marked as X, and those are the cities that we consider as tier 1 for this research purpose. So the need for entrepreneurship support, is different across different life cycle stages. At the early stage, the startup is just emerged, and it has what is generally called as liability of newness and liability of smallness. Both of these needs to be resolved, and that can be resolved from an external support also. There are a lot of resource constraints in the early stages of the startup, and product development during early stages takes priority over revenue growth, etc. But when you progress towards a growing startup that is no more in its early stage, we need specialized services, strategic relationship has to be mediated, all of that. So overall, you can look at incubators as broadly supporting with respect to providing resources, either what the resources they have, or mediate towards the larger, broader system. So this itself leads us to the system construct. So there are two ways in which the system construct with respect to entrepreneurship innovation can be looked at. On the left side, you see the entrepreneurial ecosystem construct. On the right side, you see a regional innovation system construct. So the regional innovation system construct is actually geographic in nature, in the sense the clusters, special economic zones, software technology parks, all of these form regional innovation systems, where government allocates the land, and then it is given for development by private and other parties. Whereas the entrepreneurial ecosystem is not merely geographic. It could be a larger area, but it does not have an administrative center and does not need any land being given off with a subsidized cost, etc. So what Mason and Brown defined entrepreneurial ecosystem is a coalescence of entrepreneurial actors, organizations, and processes. Interestingly, the evolution of entrepreneurial ecosystem is dynamic, in the sense there is no need for an external intervention to change or evolve a specific entrepreneurial ecosystem. The actors and process and themselves will kick in to make it more appropriate for a specific type of entrepreneurship and the system as a whole. Whereas in the case of regional innovation system, somebody outside has to intervene to make it evolve. So the construct that we are talking about with respect to this whole thesis is around the entrepreneurial ecosystem construct. This construct broadly visualized by Balsubrahmanya sir back in 2007. So if you can place the industry, academia, the triad as a whole, and the prospective technology startup at the middle, they need two different set of things. One is what is being called here as the indispensable factors. That includes finance, market, human resources, etc., and the support system. So our basic concern with respect to this entrepreneurial ecosystem concept is the support system, and incubator forms that critical support system. Of course, there are other supplementary factors that add to this entrepreneurial ecosystem construct. Incubation actually has a lot of stakeholders. In here, we don't separately call for incubator itself, because that's a very intermediary organization. So we consider stakeholders as government, private sector, including startups and investors, universities, for example. The problem with having many stakeholders is that their own objectives will be different, and they could be technological, where the university might be looking at commercialization. Government may be looking at economic and job growth, for example. There could be political reasons for actually calling incubation entrepreneurship support as a development theme, for example. All of this obviously means that it's sort of necessary to evaluate how much of their own objectives they have achieved. Governments play a bridging role, because private sector is not willing to develop such entrepreneurial support infrastructure and access, for example, and access to finance for startups has to be encouraged by the government itself by playing that role. Incubation also involves a lot of processes that we are concerned, and that's typically orchestrated by some of the stakeholders and incubators as well. These involves selection of startups that are going to benefit from the incubation itself. provisioning resources through mediation and providing assistance with respect to business, etc. Cooper's 1985 actually called the opportunity identification and recognition actually happens during incubation. Of course, other things like utilization of resources happen, but what the startup is trying to do is create options during the course of incubation itself. A much formative study from Bergek and Norman back in 2000 considers these four axes. First is selection, high selection criteria versus low selection criteria. The strength of intervention, where it's a high intervention versus a laissez-faire type of an intervention that you can provide during incubation, providing business support and other mediation. So if you actually classify incubators based on this, you would get archetypes of incubators that we can separately look for how they are performing itself. Performance assessment of incubators is in itself difficult. As we saw, the objectives of individual stakeholders is first of all different and difficult to assess. Second, at what level should we be picking this? FAN back in 2005, it's also a very formative paper with respect to incubation. Talking about four levels. One is at the science park and incubator level, and at the startup and entrepreneur level, and finally at the system level. So what should we be considering with respect to the levels of analysis is a critical question, and we have made a choice with respect to our thesis, and we are presenting some of those results. There are difficulties that arise with respect to how we define performance itself. Priorities with respect to nations may change. There could be local idiosyncrasies that doesn't allow us to compare, performance. So comparing incubators, is a easy way out, but we are not, Kayaza actually said that don't do benchmarking of incubators. Rather, consider which types have actually achieved specific objectives, specific performance criteria, for example. Barbero back in 2012 figured out that university-based incubators were able to achieve their objectives better than regional development type incubators. Again, Bergek Norman clearly says that attention has to be paid to both the goal and how much of that goal was actually achieved as outcomes and how should we be measuring it. Tavaletti actually says that if you are using a public resource, meaning taxpayers' money, he has a seething commentary that it's potentially a waste of public, money by creating incubators. So, which means it's important that we evaluate incubators and then compare them. So how do we measure incubator itself? Here we are suggesting the three stakeholders that we primarily identified. The startup could be measured with respect to their performance, with respect to their value adds or the growth itself, the learning outcomes, for example, R&D inputs and outputs, how the firm is growing, how much money it takes to generate a single job, for example. At the university, it's probably a different set of problems where we need to evaluate how the knowledge is flowing from the universities to the incubated ventures at the incubator, and how much of them are actually getting commercialized and getting developed into new products. Are there extension of it? Those are very interesting measures that we can do. How many of the faculty students are actually exploring and exploiting whatever research that they have done, and are they pursuing entrepreneurship is also a sort of a important measure at the university level. Similarly, at government level, primarily around regional development, economic outcomes, and intellectual property and infrastructure resources. Because there's a lot of percentage GDP wise, if you look at it, what goes into higher education and broadly research, needs to be evaluated with respect to economic and sustainability outcomes. Sustainability of incubators itself is a point to be evaluated. So broadly, we can now arrive at our research gaps. Stakeholder objectives are sort of not adequately covered with respect to evaluation, as in how did that affect the incubation's outcome itself. Startup specific studies are also underrepresented. Within that, of course, technology development as a intermediate capability is underrepresented. There are obviously dearth of empirical studies with respect to incubators in India, and newer methods like rating and ranking are not picked up that well as one would have imagined. And the emergence of incubators, specifically considering India as a transitioning economy, has to be studied because in the developed economies, you generally assume that incubators are already existing.